anything, let me express my condolences about everything that has been going on inside Iran. We know that it has been things that the events that we have observed happening inside Iran are extremely unfortunate during the past 8 months. It's been just extremely devastating to see what's happening there. We all know how it feels. A lot of us have been depressed. A lot of us have been extremely anxious. We have felt burnt out by just following the news, especially for those of us who live outside of Iran. The only thing that basically we can see, or the only way that we can follow what's going on inside Iran is the news. And sometimes this news that comes out of Iran is dark, and it's overwhelming. Although it's not everything, there is life going on in Iran. There is non-political life going on, but we Iranians outside of Iran, I guess, are mostly exposed to the darker part of what's happening inside Iran. In any way, it's been very unfortunate to see how the protests have been cracked down inside Iran, and how still there are a lot of people, mostly innocent people, in prison, and how they are forced to confess the things that they haven't done. How there is this basically non-independent justice system inside the political structure of Iran that unjustly executes people. We just heard that 3 people in Isfahan were executed. It's just extremely unfortunate. It's very uncivilized and barbaric to see that executions still happen inside the country. So anyway, just wanted to express my condolences. And with that, let me introduce this session to you. If you have not been in the Iran Circle sessions in the past, the Iran Circle is an initiative that we started since 2017 in Boston. Our sessions started physically at Harvard at that time for a few years until we hit the pandemic. And of course, this was, bad in many ways, but it was a blessing in the way that it made us also able to communicate non-locally with everyone, including scholars and audience globally. And the purpose of this was to create a bridge between scholars and the public, to basically make it easier for people to learn what is being produced in the academic circles. So it is a platform for scholars to try to basically present what they have worked on, and we try to have this happen in a way that it's easier for the public to understand. And this is the first time that we are holding these sessions in English, because we have realized that a lot of the knowledge that is being produced is in English, and it is important to also be able to get that knowledge out there, even when we can't do it in Farsi. We can try to translate it later to Farsi and let people who are not comfortable listening to these sessions in English still utilize this knowledge. So let me introduce this session. As you know, the topic of this session is Iranian revolutionaries in the United States. It is based on a book by Dr. Manijeh Moradian, named This Flame Within, which I hope every one of you will have the opportunity to get a copy of the book and read it. I got a copy myself and I've been reading it. It's really well written. It's really a pleasure to just read it. It's so easy to read. So thank you, Dr. Moradian, for that, for such a nicely written book. And in this session, what we are trying to achieve is that to understand what the Iranian diaspora does and how it behaves when it gets to revolutionary stages. So this book has been written about the 1979 revolution. It explains, it tries to explore how people, the Iranian diaspora, behaved and what they did before 1979, and what they were thinking, what their ideologies were, and what we want to understand is that what can we learn from that experience. We want to understand what did we do right to make a revolution happen, if today another revolution is inevitable, and what did they do wrong that we can learn from and we can avoid. You know, we have seen during the past months that Iranians have, outside of Iran, the Iranian diaspora have got together. They have made coalitions. They have made groups for political activism and for showing solidarity with what's going on inside Iran. But we know that without being able to support the people inside Iran, we are not going to be able to have a constructive impact. And unfortunately, what we have observed during the past few months is that some of the patterns, it seems like some of the patterns that we have had in the past have been repeated. We saw that we had this session at Georgetown University where you know, political and you know, famous figures got together. They spoke about the situation. They tried to form a coalition, but later on, a few months later, we saw how that got dissolved and how this got you know, disintegrated. And we want to understand why is that keeps happening, and that why we Iranians have trouble with working together in a constructive way, and how that is not going to help the people inside Iran for, you know, getting there, for basically getting to democracy and freedom at the end of the day, because that's what they want and that's what we want, and we want to try to understand how that works. So with that introduction of the session, let me introduce Dr. Moradian and ask her to invite her to the stage for her talk. Manijeh Moradian is an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Barnard College. She received her PhD in American Studies from NYU and her MFA in creative nonfiction from Hunter College, City University of New York. She is the former co-editor of the Association of Iranian American Writers. Her book, This Flame Within, Iranian Revolutionaries in the United States, has already been published from Duke University Press in fall 2022. Her essays and articles have appeared in Routledge Handbook of the Global 60s. Scholars and Feminists Online, Women's Studies Quarterly, Comparative Studies of South Asian, Africa, and the Middle East, Social Text Online, Jadalia, Tehran Bureau, Bitarov, and Kalalu, if I'm right. She's a member of Jadalia's Iran page editorial board and a founding member of Raha Iranian Feminist Collective. So with that, let me, in the interest of time, invite Dr. Moradian to start her talk. And then after that, I will introduce Dr. Persis Karim and invite her to join the panel for a dialogue.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amin, for that introduction. And I'm very grateful to you and to Iran Circle for providing this forum to make that bridge and to break down the walls between the academy and the rest of the kind of political conversations that are happening. So thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today, especially here with Dr. Karim. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the book and share some slides. I hope everyone can see that, and I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes.
I'm in New York City, and sometimes there's a lot of background noise, but hopefully you can hear me. So, okay, I'm just going to launch in. So this Flame Within, Iranian Revolutionaries in the United States, is a diasporic feminist reappraisal of the history of the Iranian Students Association, the ISA, which was the US affiliate of the Confederation of Iranian Students National Union, or CISNU. So the Confederation was a transnational formation with chapters across Europe and Canada and also in Turkey and India. And the ISA was like the US affiliate of that organization. From the early 1960s until the revolution in 1979, CISNU really became the largest diasporic student opposition to the Shah of Iran. By the late 1960s, many CISNU members had become Marxists of different varieties and dedicated their lives to the revolutionary overthrow of the Western-backed dictatorship in Iran. So the arc of the book follows the journeys of these students from Iran to the US, back to Iran for the revolution, and then back to the US where they fled into exile. I have studied the ISA on its own terms, as a product of its own times, but I've also mined this history for lessons that can assist in the unfinished transnational project of dismantling gender, sexual, racial, ethnic, religious, class, and other oppressions as they are constituted by Western imperial powers and by successive authoritarian governments in Iran. Following queer and feminist scholars who have critiqued the binary oppositions on which imperialism and nationalism rest, I reject the gendered notions of freedom and unfreedom that undergird the US-Iran standoff and turn instead to look at a movement that targeted precisely the intersection of imperialism and dictatorship, the ISA or CISNU. The book is also an effort to rethink diasporic nostalgia outside of narrow nationalistic terms and in relation to melancholic attachments to the possibility of revolutionary transformation. Now, when I say that my project is concerned with diasporic feminism, I just want to be very clear that I'm referring to the analytical and political approach that I take to this history. The ISA was not a feminist organization, and I've written in detail about its problematic gender and sexual politics. Nonetheless, I argue that the ISA should be understood as part of a genealogy of third world liberation movements that created the conditions in which new forms of revolutionary feminism arose globally. Iranian foreign students were part of that process, and this book attempts to grapple with what that means for diasporic subjectivity and politics today. Just briefly, my research consisted of interviews with former ISA members. I interviewed about 30 former ISA members, as well as extensive archival research in library and private collections. For me, the ISA became a vehicle for an exploration of revolutionary subjectivity. an opportunity to theorize the process through which thousands of people become revolutionaries in any given historical moment. The book is an effort to recuperate the lived experience of revolutionary activity at the level of memory, the body, affect, emotion, and to gain insight into how Third World internationalism became a way of life for an entire generation of young activists from many different backgrounds. I wanted to recoup this revolutionary consciousness for three main reasons. First, to try to wrest away from the legacy of the Islamic Republic, from the repression and persecution they have carried out in the name of revolution, to try to wrest away from that the legitimate desire for a revolutionary response to unjust power. Second, to better understand how and why so many activists of that era adhered to what I consider hierarchical and masculinist visions of revolution, which ultimately reproduced patriarchal authoritarianism in country after country, including in Iran. And finally, I wanted to see what happens if we view the Iranian Revolution from the vantage point of the movements that failed to hold sway, including those of the diasporic left and that of the brief women's uprising in March 1979 in Tehran, an uprising launched spontaneously by thousands of women who dared to demand full equality in the post-Shah society. I wanted to situate this March 79 uprising along with the experiences of Iranian women in the ISA and on the Iranian left more broadly as part of that genealogy of third world feminism that I was talking about, and to tease out key lessons for diasporic and transnational feminism today. So I'll just share a few key points from the book. The first is that radical subjectivities, politics, and collectives can develop from within spaces of privilege, from the center, so to speak, and not only from the margins. I understand the geographic location of American colleges and universities akin to an imperial metropole during the era of US Cold War empire. Foreign students were recruited to study in the US as part of the Cold War strategy of promoting Western ideals, attitudes, and knowledge in the contest with communism. Iranian students at this time were just one population among many foreign student diasporas, although they were by far the largest, numbering 50,000 on the eve of the Iranian Revolution. Those who came in the 1950s and throughout the 1960s were mostly from the upper and middle classes. So they were not marginalized within Iran either. This started to change in the 1970s as some lower middle class children of white collar workers were able to access scholarships. But the overall purpose of having foreign students come to the US was to produce a Western educated third world elite who would return home and develop the nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America according to US capitalist models and interests. In light of this mission, I have named foreign students of this era, quote unquote, imperial model minorities, and argued that they were supposed to model the benevolence of Pax Americana, or they were supposed to embody the ideal of the US as the indispensable nation spreading progress and hope. And also they were supposed to divert attention away from the fact that all too often this progress came hand in hand with intense state repression from US-backed dictatorships, including that of the Shah. My term, imperial model minority, is in dialogue with Asian American Studies scholarship on model minority immigrant, on the figure of the model minority immigrant or citizen. But I adapted the term to describe the temporary migrant populations of generally elite students and to highlight the global role they were supposed to play in integrating racialized populations and third world economies into the post-World War II US world order. And I'm happy to say more about that in the discussion. It's kind of a quick gloss of a lot there. But the category of imperial model minority, like that of the model minority citizen, was often overwhelmed by the very contradictions it was meant to erase. The process of recruiting and educating imperial model minorities sometimes went terribly awry, resulting in the admission of students who were hostile to US domination over their home countries. I wanted to understand how this process unfolded, how it was that some Iranian imperial model minorities decided to spend their time abroad trying to overthrow the very order they were charged with spreading. I found it necessary to tune in to the registers of affect, which I understand to be the accumulation of lived experiences, bodily intensities filled with potential and indeterminacy, energies that can be channeled into different political directions and worldviews depending on the circumstances. Through the interviews I conducted with former members of the ISA, I learned that the young people who joined this group had experienced a transnational process of radicalization that began with their formative experiences growing up under the Shah's regime. So in the book, I explore childhood memories of repression and resistance in Iran under the Shah that were revealed in the interviews and that traveled with these young people when they came to the US as foreign students, as college students. These memories, as I argue, were kind of loaded with these reservoirs of affective energy, what I call revolutionary affects. And I'll explain briefly what I mean and sort of how I imagine this process, working. So I draw on the work of the feminist philosopher Sarah Ahmed, and she's kind of illustrated the dynamic like this. She explains that we might experience something that puts us in an affective state of unease or discomfort, right? Like an incident of harassment, for example, but only realize later when we come to recognize that experience as part of a system of discrimination that we're angry about what happened. We might also want to better understand how that system works in order to make sense of how we've been affected. So coming into contact with others who share our affective states or moods can actually help us channel our affects in particular directions towards particular political ideologies and organizations. As the sociologist Deborah Gould argues, social movements provide, quote, an emotional pedagogy, a guide for what and how to feel and what to do in light of those feelings. So a kind of interpretive lens for affects and emotions, right? So for hundreds and then thousands of Iranian foreign students in the US, the ISA became the vehicle through which they could make sense of affects and emotions that were out of sync with a teleological view of progress that hinged on support for dictatorship. Moreover, the ISA made it possible to do something about this discrepancy. Affect thus became a conduit toward new political horizons, new ideas about what kinds of feelings and actions were permissible and desirable. The concept of revolutionary affects, therefore, refers to the sensorial material out of which a revolutionary consciousness can later be fashioned, and to those affects that attach to and fuel the project of making a revolution. The revolutionary affects of former ISA members were forged through encounters with police state repression and with resistance in Iran, through exposure to leftist ideas and struggle in the US, and also through being in a global context, right, of anti-colonial and anti-racist revolutionary organizing that was happening around the world and was also permeating US society and US campuses by the late 1960s. So revolutionary affects really fueled a kind of relentless pace of activism as the ISA endeavored to win Americans over to their cause, right? They wanted to expose the Shah and convince Americans to pressure the US government to withdraw all of the economic, military, and political support to the Iranian regime. So ISA members expressed their anger towards US policy in Iran and their desires for revolution in many different ways. And I'm going to show some examples. They carried out hunger strikes. So this is a leaflet from the Washington, D.C. chapter of the ISA. And you can see here, this is a picture of students, sitting in and carrying out a hunger strike in order to protest the torture of political prisoners in Iran and call attention to that. And they're wearing these very crude cardboard masks because with the permission of the US government, SAVAK agents were operating in the US, spying on students, taking their pictures, keeping tabs on them, and threatening their families back home. So ISA members started wearing these masks to try to protect their identities and those of their family members. ISA members occupied consulates, embassies, buildings, and one time they even occupied the crown of the Statue of Liberty. This is the front page of Resistance, which was the English language publication of the ISA. So you can see they really wanted to make their struggle legible to Americans. They had an entire publication in English. And you can see here they did like a banner drop. They actually had two banners. One says "Down with the Shah," and the other one that you can't read very well says "Free the 18," which was a reference to 18 political prisoners who were going to trial in Iran. So they did these kind of spectacular events to try to get media attention and, expose the contradictions of the greatest democracy in the world, supporting a regime that was torturing dissidents, right? They protested that, so the Shah would come every year, pretty much every year. He would go to the White House, whether it was a Democrat or Republican, it didn't matter. And the ISA, of course, would always show up and protest those visits. They would also protest the numerous honorary degrees the Shah was awarded by many, many, many universities, American universities. And, the theme was usually about political prisoners. So here's an example of a flyer, one of many kind of very, very typical of the style of a lot of their propaganda was to try to cut through the glitz and the glamour, the way that the Shah and the Queen were represented in the US media was as these sort of enlightened monarchs, very glamorous celebrities, this sort of fascination with royalty. And, the ISA was trying to cut through that, right? And say behind this shiny veneer is torture, is execution, is brutality, right? That's what this is really about. So I kept finding evidence of Iranian anti-Shah student activists in also some very unlikely places. So these were some of the ISA protests around the Shah that I just shared with you. But I also found evidence of Iranians participating in many other movements. For example, the San Francisco State Strike in 1968-69, which was a historic, really epic movement that really brought into being new forms of coalitional organizing. The Thorough Liberation Front and the Black Student Union led this strike, and they really made connections between the different kinds of oppression that Black people had faced, that Chicanos faced, Indigenous people faced, Asian immigrants faced, and they were really trying to make connections with different kinds of racism, different kinds of oppression, and they struck to demand all kinds of changes to the curriculum, the faculty, the student body, to really try to turn it into an anti-racist institution. And these were not demands that the ISA or Iranian students shared at all. They were not immigrants, they were not minority Americans, right? They were just on their student visas, supposed to get their degrees and go back home. And yet, several of them really threw themselves into the struggle. This is an image from one of the mass mobilizations during the strike, and I drew a circle around ISA member Khosrow Kalantari, who was a San Francisco State student at the time, an ISA member, a very important ISA member, a leader, and he was, very involved. He was one of the recognized student leaders. This is of the strike. This is a satirical leaflet put out by the strike committee, and you can see Khosrow's name is listed among the top student leaders who were wanted for crimes against the state. It's a sort of a pun on the state in terms of the government, but also San Francisco state, and this kind of recognition that he was among the most supposedly threatening, student leaders helping to lead the strike. I also found evidence of the ISA in the Black Panther newspaper, and in the book I write about some of the joint organizing that happened in the San Francisco Bay Area in Oakland between the ISA and the Black Panther Party. But this is from the January 1970 issue of the Black Panther Party newspaper. It's hard to read; it's a kind of bad mimeographed copy here, but you can see there's this message of solidarity and support from the ISA featured there. The ISA was really involved in trying to free Black political prisoners. They made the connection between opposing political prisoners in Iran, opposing the imprisonment of dissidents in Iran. And so it was kind of very obvious, especially at the level of affect, they also felt, well, this is really unfair that they're putting these Black revolutionaries in prison. So this is a poster that was made by the artist Nikki Najumi, who was an ISA member in New York City. and it features Bobby Seale, one of the co-founders of the Black Panther Party, and of course Angela Davis, prominent Black revolutionary and feminist leader. Both of them were in prison at the time. And the ISA, they made this poster and they wheat pasted it all over New York City, just as part of the course of their activities, their weekly activities. They were also involved in many rallies to free other imprisoned Black Panther leaders like Huey Newton. The ISA was involved in the movement against the war in Vietnam. In particular, they worked very closely with Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, which again was based in the Bay Area, and became a national student anti-war organization, and really kind of launched many different leftist formations, came out of SDS. And so the ISA was jointly organizing. You can see in this flyer, they were having demonstrations on, against the Shah of Iran and US imperialism in Iran. They were connecting those struggles as part of the broader project of the US trying to prop up dictatorships and put down popular revolutions throughout Asia. This is a rally outside the San Francisco Federal Building, I think, rally against the war in Vietnam. But you can see how this anti-war movement became a gathering point for all of the anti-imperialist struggles. You can see the Down with the Shah posters, and also right in the center in the back, you can see the Arab students were there, and you can see signs Free Iranian Political Prisoners on the right. Vietnam will triumph, right? So people really coming together around that. The ISA was also systematically organized in joint organizing with Arab students around the freedom in Palestine. The Shah and Israel were understood to be the two pillars of US imperialism in the region, and the ISA really one Palestinian activist I interviewed from those days said, they were more Palestinian than the Palestinians. They were always there, absolutely consistent. They had a regional vision for freedom, right, in which Iran and Palestine had a joint future and an intertwined fate. So in the book, I theorize about kind of what compelled Iranians to become involved in so many other struggles, many of which had nothing directly to do with US policy in Iran. And so I developed the concept affects of solidarity to explain how the revolutionary affects of differently situated populations overlapped and combined to create affective attachments to the liberation of others. So let me give you an example from one of the interviews I conducted. Jalil Mostashari was an ISA member in the mid-1960s in East Lansing, Michigan, and he described his student activist days in the US in this very matter-of-fact manner. He said, "The Black struggle was a part of the total international struggle for me. It was not only them. Sometimes the United Auto Workers needed people on their picket line in Detroit. When Arab students had an action, we would participate in it. When we had an action, they would participate in it. Eritreans would come with us. Afghan students would come with us. Some people from Bengal, they were leftists, they would come with us." And when I asked Jalil what motivated such a high level of commitment to so many different causes, he looked me in the eyes, held my gaze, and spoke with the gravity of someone expressing a sacred truth. He said, quote, "If you want people to sympathize with you, you have to sympathize with them at the time of their need. You cannot just say things. You've got to believe it really in your heart. You have to have this flame within you that can warm others. You cannot say it with your tongue. It doesn't move anybody." So the book takes its title from Jalil's words and from the description of the relationship between affective energy and political action embedded within it. To have, quote, "this flame within" is to embody a politics of solidarity as animating energy that burns, warms, and moves people towards others with whom they sense something shared. Affects of solidarity are generated when revolutionary affects or desires for revolution circulate and converge across different populations and movements. Affects of solidarity draw people together from widely differing contexts and facilitate joint political action across the boundaries of race, class, gender, sexuality, religion, language, and nationality. Iranians were not experiencing racism the way that African Americans were in the United States, and they were not experiencing imperialism the way the Vietnamese were. Yet for each of these groups, the liberation of the other became intertwined with their own desires for freedom, and thus became deeply rewarding. And I'll just show this image from Dانشجو, the Persian language periodical of the Confederation of Iranian Students. They followed all of the anti-colonial movements around the world. And when the Vietnamese won, when the Vietnamese successfully kicked the US out, this was celebrated. This was considered a victory for the Iranian movement as well. It was felt deeply and profoundly as a step forward for everybody, and celebrated in that way. So my argument is that affects of solidarity describe the affective state or mood that made third world internationalism possible. This history shows, I think, what is possible, right? And I hope it can help us imagine new forms of affiliation and solidarity between Iranians and many other liberation movements today. My second main point is about the relationship between the celebrated history of third world internationalism and the development of the concepts at the heart of revolutionary feminisms, by which I mean feminisms that are anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, and that understand the liberation of women as inextricably bound up with the elimination of all forms of oppression. In the 1960s and 70s, affects of solidarity did not attach equally to all liberation movements. Notably, feminist and gay liberation movements were not common areas of affiliation for the third world Marxist left or for the ISA, or rather including the ISA. So rather than idealizing solidarity or romanticizing that era, I focus on the gender and sexual politics of the ISA as a case study of the contradictions and limitations of the third world Marxist left, from the late 60s and 70s. So just briefly, women and men in the ISA were influenced by debates over the problem of what they called male chauvinism, to use the language of the time, debates that were playing out all around them in the radical student milieu. So within SDS, within the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, within the Black Panther Party, all these radical revolutionary movements were having debates over what is the place of women, what do we mean by gender equality, what about sexuality, how do we think about all those things, right? The ISA, for its part, decided to form women's committees. They instituted gender quotas at all levels of leadership, and they worked to recruit and retain as many women as possible. And this slide is from the ISA's celebration of International Women's Day in March of 1979. But what I include it because it gives you a kind of visual landscape of how the third world Marxist left, including ISA members, imagined what it meant to make space for women as revolutionaries, right? To include women fully within the movement as these revolutionary figures, right? Guerrilla fighters, as political prisoners, these kinds of images of women who were dedicating their lives to revolutionary struggle. This was sort of the global imaginary, right? That made a place for women. So the way that the third world Marxist left formulated the sort of issue of gender and sexuality, they didn't really use those words, but the basic problem as they saw it was this, that it was clear that the systems of imperialism, capitalism, and racism could not be overturned without unity between men and women working together towards revolution. The concern was that by paying attention to gender and sexuality, or to the problems that were particular to women, that this would be divisive and it would distract from the so-called primary struggle against imperialism. Feminism was understood to be synonymous with separatism, like that women should go off and form their own movements, and therefore counter to that united struggle, that unity that was required for racialized and colonized peoples, right? At the same time, Iranian women in the ISA were not just sort of submitting to the dominance of male revolutionaries. Like their American counterparts from many different racial backgrounds, they had their own deeply compelling affective attachments to revolution. They wanted a free and democratic Iran just as much as the men. Furthermore, as the feminist scholar Minu has explained, the chance to become valued for one's political commitments and activity, rather than only for marriage and social reproduction, was empowering for many Iranian women leftists. Empowering, but not liberating, to quote one former ISA member. So in the book, I discuss the gender and sexual politics of the ISA in detail. I consider how differences within the ISA around class were sort of managed through gender, right, in order to maintain unity. There was what I call an ideology of gender sameness, combined with a set of practices the feminist scholar Parveen Paidar has called masculinization. The idea was that among leftists, men and women were already equal, as this image shows, right? Women can be revolutionaries too, right? Women, of course, were eager to prove that they could do anything men could do. But the terms of this equality, the terms of belonging within the movement, were contingent upon women hiding their bodies with baggy clothes, cutting their hair short, refusing to wear makeup and jewelry. In short, erasing any signs of femininity in order to prove they were serious, quote unquote, serious revolutionaries, and in order not to distract the men. This was partly a reaction against the association of femininity with the westernized bourgeoisie in Iran that was complicit with the Shah's dictatorship. Miniskirts, makeup, hypersexualization, and commodification of women's bodies, this was all a part of imperial modernity. And the category of the feminine was tainted by this set of associations. It was a degraded category, which rendered the female body a site of corruption of the nation and weakness for the movement. By covering up and adopting a masculinist version of revolutionary comportment and style, women could redeem themselves and reinvent themselves as revolutionary subjects worthy of respect. Gender sameness and masculinization were features of other revolutionary leftist movements as well, which shared an association of femininity with weakness, sexual objectification, westernization, and complicity with the bourgeoisie or with capitalism. I trace some of those connections and similarities in the book, but the other important link was the idea that issues of women's oppression, as they said at the time, could only be solved after the socialist revolution. The primary struggle was against imperialism, and everything else was secondary. This partial and flawed yet significant the partial and flawed yet significant attempts among ISA members to address gender inequality form a kind of prehistory to the encounter with the revolution in Iran and the new forms of gender and sexual regulation that were initiated by the provisional government in March 1979. In a critical chapter of the book, I read the women's uprising of March 79 in Tehran as part of what I'm calling this genealogy of intersectional anti-imperialism. And what I mean is that there was a recognition among some leftist women that the structures of patriarchy coming from the Shah's westernizing dictatorship and from the nascent Islamic revolution overlapped. They overlapped and combined to oppress women in different ways. I borrow the term intersectional from the Black feminist tradition, going back to the Third World Women's Alliance, the Combahee River Collective, developed by Black feminist scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins. But the concept really comes from the experiences of women who were part of larger movements, anti-racist movements, who argued that gender and sexual oppression intersected or overlapped with racism, capitalism, and imperialism, and that real liberation would only be possible if revolutionary politics addressed that intersection. That was really the starting point for Third World feminism. So in Iran, on International Women's Day, March 8th, 1979, women had mobilized to denounce new forms of gender discrimination before they were enshrined into law. And these are, of course, some of these iconic, famous images of those days of mass demonstrations and sit-ins that unfolded that week. these women rightly understood that the restrictions on women's clothing, the announcement from Khomeini that women would have to wear hijab in government offices, that women couldn't be judges, some of these kinds of things that the government was starting to say. These women in the streets, they understood that those attacks on women were part of a broader curtailment of freedom and part of a reneging of promises of equality more broadly. So based on my close reading of the French feminist documentary about the uprising, which is called Iranian Women's Liberation Movement Year Zero, and on other speeches and documents that were produced by women's organizations coming out of these days of protests, as well as the personal memories of some participants who I interviewed, returning ISA members who I interviewed, I argue that this was the moment when the revolutionary affects of tens of thousands of Iranian women who had been actually part of the revolution diverged from all of the major existing organizations and ideologies across the political spectrum, with almost very few exceptions, really. This divergence cannot accurately be understood through the binary logics of the West versus Islam or secular versus Islam that too often shape the current era of US-Iran relations. And that too often distort feminism into a pro-US interventionist position. In fact, there was remarkable agreement in March 79 among the secular left, the liberal nationalists, and the Islamists that women's rights were at best a distraction and at worst a Western conspiracy to weaken the revolution. And the women here, they were not marching against Islam in general or against hijab in general. They were marching against the state enforcing second-class citizenship on women in the form of mandatory hijab and denying women full agency over their bodies and full access to all of the avenues of employment and education and full participation in the society, right? So because revolutionary affects are embedded within power relations and emerge in response to them, the lived experiences of gender and sexual oppression in society and within revolutionary movements had the power to unleash new political orientations. This dynamic was actually part of revolutionary anti-colonial movements all over the world. And I find it very helpful to see Iran not as some sort of tragic exception wrenched out of historical time by the rise of a Shia theocracy, but as an example of similar conflicts between national liberation and women's liberation, between anti-imperialism and democracy, right, that were playing out globally, each in a particular local context. In the context of the Iranian Revolution, we can see how an intersectional approach to anti-imperialism emerged from within the revolutionary movement itself. When these tens of thousands of women took to the streets in March, they were protesting multiple overlapping forms of oppression: the Western imperial domination over Iran, the Shah's dictatorship, and new forms of authoritarianism enacted in the name of Islam. They understood it was impossible for Iranian women to be free unless all forms of domination were dismantled. Their demands were not legible within the hierarchical mode of revolutionary politics that dominated at the time, the primary versus secondary, right? Okay, so my conclusion, thank you for listening. I think I've talked long enough. To conclude, the history of ISA members grappling with gender oppression, with patriarchy, with the role of women in movements, the fact that they form women's committees, and the fact that they actually tried to parse the connections between gender and sexual oppression in Iran and in the US, between the patriarchal dictatorship and imperial domination. This is absolutely essential for us to think with, to adapt and think with today, in order to imagine new forms of collective solidarity that involve Iran and Iranians in the mix of broader struggles for social justice and transformation. By excavating an affective history of Iranian revolutionaries in the US before 1979, this flame within attempts to transmit those affective intensities and desires to future generations who might channel them into new activist experiments. These past few months, obviously, we've seen really an unprecedented developments in Iran. We've seen on the streets of cities and towns how the accumulated desires for freedom of generations of Iranian women have unleashed revolutionary affects powerful enough to ignite a national uprising, to bring men into the streets this time, and to pose the most serious challenge to the Islamic Republic in its entire history. Finally, there is broad understanding, excuse me, sorry, I've been sick, so I'm talking a lot. Finally, there is broad understanding that the oppression of women and ethnic minorities is not secondary, but at the core of the entire authoritarian state structure. What remains to be seen is what political and organizational form these revolutionary affects will take, both in Iran and in diaspora. And that is where I hope the book can make some small contribution. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moradian, for presenting this great research work. It's very impressive what you have collected here in this research. You know, I think the most important thing that strikes me as impressive is that when I see this this history of the pre-1979 revolution, I realize that what we are experiencing today as Woman Life Freedom Revolution is not something that is completely departed from the past history. It is only a continuation of a series of struggles, despite the popular belief today, especially in the younger generation, that this is a completely new movement that has nothing to do with what has been going on in the past. So thank you so much for bringing this to our attention and for letting us learn this. So let me introduce Dr. Persis Karim and invite her to join this panel and have a dialogue about the topic with Manijeh. Persis Karim holds the Neda Nobari Endowed Chair and is the director of the newly established Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State University. She is also a professor in the Department of Comparative Literature. Prior to coming to San Francisco State University, Dr. Karim was the founding director of Persian Studies at San Jose State University, where she taught courses in world and comparative literature, U.S. ethnic and diaspora literature, global studies, film, and Middle East studies. So with that introduction, Dr. Karim, please join the panel and yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Amin, so much for making this possible. I've had the opportunity to be in conversation with Manijeh around her work, both before the book and currently, and I'm so pleased to be still involved with her ideas, and I think they're incredibly important to understanding the current moment in Iran and also in the sort of diaspora. And one of the things that I want to say before I sort of launch into maybe being in conversation is that I think Manijeh's book is just remarkable because it has this sort of kaleidoscopic view of this particular moment in history, the period between the 60s and 70s. It's local history, i.e. something as immediate as San Francisco State, 1968, student strike, 67, 68 student strike. And while it's doing that, it's also doing the work to position this local history, American struggles around civil rights in some kind of global context. While it's not new in terms of thinking about like the 1968 uprisings around the globe, I think what Manijeh, you have done is to really sort of parse out this idea that like these struggles were happening in a kind of web and a ripple effect. and that they were influencing each other and also borrowing from the language of this particular moment in history. So it's a great piece of scholarship, but also really important for thinking about the ways in which we are struggling, I think, in this moment to think about both transnational, international, and local struggles around things like, Black Lives Matter and woman life freedom, and also the reaction and the reactionary responses to these struggles. So thank you for this really marvelous book. I love hearing you talk about it. And I think you've assembled, as Amin points out, a lot of material that really was almost lost to us. So the recuperative quality of it, to sort of bring it back and, 47, 48, almost 50 years after, is really important. And I think it's a really important history for Iranians to have access to. So I just wanted to say that's really wonderful work.
Thank you, Persis. I couldn't have done it without you. You know that.
Thank you. Yeah. I wonder if one of the places we could start would be to think a little bit about the question of gender and the struggle for women's participation in some of those earlier struggles, and this very immediate moment when woman life freedom is the absolute exemplar of how women are being put at the center of this struggle in Iran, or we hope will sustain that central place in the struggle for Iran. To think a little bit about how differently what was occurring in the ISA and CISNU in the period of the 60s and 70s versus what it tells us about transnational feminist solidarities in this moment. And that's a broad question, but I think it's a way in which we can sort of maybe excavate your historical research with the now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the movements of today, they of course inherit the legacies of the past, I mean, I think of what's happening in Iran right now as a kind of, it's like a post-colonial, moment, right? And the time of the ISA and CISNU is the time of the anti-colonial revolutions, right? All over the world. And in every single case, and I really make a point of this because I'm always pushing against exceptionalizing Iran or reducing all the problems to something about Iranian culture or Shiism or something like that, because it's remarkable that, in all of the national liberation movements that we can study, and I even drew on some work from the Chinese context, you have this kind of contradiction in terms of revolutionary movements that have a leftist orientation, where there's a kind of rhetoric about gender equality. I mean, people would quote Mao, and who said that women hold up half the sky, and so there was a lot of rhetoric and sort of verbal commitment to, like, women are equal. Of course, it's half of society, but the way that women's oppression and liberation was understood was always as a kind of byproduct of larger systems. So women are oppressed because of capitalism or feudalism, and so therefore, if we overthrow capitalism, we'll get, then we can liberate women, right? As if these were just sort of byproducts and it would all be sort of automatic. And I think that what people have realized or really suffered and learned the hard way, right, is that even when national liberation movements succeeded and national sovereignty was achieved, that did not automatically result in liberation or freedom or democracy or equality for many groups, not only women, but also religious and ethnic minorities, and also, of course, the poor. The class divisions weren't overturned. Sometimes they were reorganized, but incredible inequality economically persists in place after place. And this is true across what was once called the third world. So you know, the right-wing response to that is to say, oh, look, these people can't govern themselves. Look what a mess they've made of their countries, right? Right. That's what the right likes to say. From the left, we have to say, well, the revolution is unfinished, right? You know, it's not enough to simply have you know, national sovereignty. That's important. You know, we don't want to go back to being colonized, right? But that's not enough, you know, that we actually need to transform social relations, to reorganize social reproduction, and to understand how capitalism works through organizing people and regulating people around things like race and gender and sexuality and ethnicity, right? These are actually ways that governments govern, right? Is through these operations and different ways of regulating and targeting different populations. So the struggle is unfinished. And, you know, I think that it's not only, you know, in even the third world. I mean, if you look at the way that Black feminist ideas are at the center of the Black Lives Matter movement, it's like, you know, people aren't trying to repeat the old Black liberation movements that had, you know, male domination or whatever, right? They're doing it differently, right? People have learned the lessons of history. They've inherited the lessons of the women who came before them. And they're trying for something much more capacious, much more intersectional, much more holistic. We can use different words for it. But I think that that's a phenomenon that we see in Latin America. We see across, you know, Asia, West Asia, and, you know, the Palestinian feminist movement being so central now to, you know, we see it in place after place, this recognition, you know, that gender and sexuality are not side issues, they're not secondary, right? That they're at the core of how society actually functions and is organized, and they have to be at the core of how we imagine liberation as well.
And that might also be why, for example, the reaction to woman life freedom is so violent and repressive, is because it is something that is unprecedented in a way, right? It's outside some of the ideological frameworks that we're familiar with. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about both the ideologies that were prevalent. I mean, you mentioned, you know, anti-imperialism as the sort of kind of umbrella under which, but there were specific ideologies in these earlier struggles. And how might that be different in this moment where people are in some ways not gravitating to one ideology like Marxism or Maoism?
Right. Yeah. I mean, Iranian student leftists, I mean, in Iran and in diaspora, you know, they were very worldly. They were studying revolutionary movements all over the world, historical as well as more contemporary movements, because they were, I think the feeling was that there were all these different models. You know, was Iran going to be like, was it like the Chinese model? Was it going to be like was it like Algeria? Was it, you know, what about the Russian Revolution? What, you know, they studied and they debated, and a lot of the factionalizing and splits that happened within the Confederation had to do with which different revolutionary idea, or what version of Marxism did you adhere to, and all of that. And I can talk more about the splits and divisions if people are interested. But the point was that there was this feeling that there were all these models to choose from, and the question was which was going to be the right one for Iran. And then, of course, what actually happened in the Iranian Revolution didn't fit any of those models, and none of the leftists saw it coming or understood it very well, right? So all of these models and studying really, it sort of became irrelevant to what happened in Iran, number one. Number two, you know, many of those countries that they'd been studying as models ended up in their own forms of authoritarianism, and in many ways, in many cases, became neo-colonies of the US and really only had nominal independence at the end of the day, right? So there's a kind of course, with today, I mean, you know, what models do we have, right? This is, we're really, if there was an abundance of models, flawed though they were back then, now I think we're, you know, many people have written about this. We sort of have, we don't have examples to point to where we go, aha, that's a society that I would like to live in. They really figured it out, right? In fact, we have, you know, the collapse of official communism decades ago. We have, China as a massive capitalist and imperialist power, and it's, like all the old models have kind of betrayed all of their best principles anyway. And so in some ways we're unburdened by, having to follow a party line or having to, apply something to Iran in that kind of doctrinaire way. We're unburdened by the orthodoxies and rigidities of some of these parties and ideologies. On the other hand, we're very weak. We're not organized, we don't have a coherent ideology. We don't have agreement. We don't have a coherent, political plan or strategy. I think that there's a lot of ideas within Iran, and certainly among feminist organizations, about the kind of society we would like to see in Iran, the kinds of freedom and democracy and commitments to equality for all that people would like to see. But we don't have a lot of strategies around power. How do you actually achieve it? How do you dislodge the government in power? And I think that it's both the desperation and the confusion and lack of ideological coherence that produces a lot of the kinds of polarizations in the diaspora, right? Where people are kind of looking for someone really powerful to come and help them, or something like that, right? And can lead to many other kinds of problems. Yeah.
So that's a good segue into another point that I wanted to maybe raise is we're seeing at least in the US diaspora context, a kind of gravitation back towards a different kind of authority, right? Some people have called for the reinstatement of the royal family, the crown prince, and many of us are troubled by that, partly because it represents exactly the kind of nostalgia of a time that is no longer, but looks better than the one we're in. And also the kind of imposition of a kind of intolerance for different approaches, right? Whether they're based on ideology or they're based on international kinds of solidarity. And I think the other thing that probably is troubling to you as it is to me is the kind of idea that like what's being perhaps lost in this rush towards like, we got to find something better, we have to remove this government, is a kind of pushing aside again of the absolute beginnings of this, which is woman, life, freedom. And I wonder if you could, I mean, you don't have a crystal ball, but I wonder if you could comment a little bit about the sort of troubling lack of critical engagement with woman, life, freedom as the important beginnings of this movement in Iran that's now entering its 8th month, and how important it is for us to maybe even be uncomfortable with that lack of organization and ideology in order to let something play out that is in fact beyond our imagination.
Yeah. I'm so glad you ended with that, because I think that's the right starting point, is that the women, life, freedom movement in Iran, in all of its diversity and unfoldingness and multiple influences, and it's got so many coming together of different grievances, right? It's crystallizing so many different grievances. I don't think it fits neatly into any of the existing models or sort of binaries. It's not a pro-Western, pro-secular, people don't want a religious government, they want a secular government, but it's not a movement that's like against all religion. It's like most Iranians, believe in some ways, right, are believers of some kind. They just don't want this government using Islam to carry out these policies, right? So it's not a movement that fits neatly into the binary logics that we have to remember come from colonization, right? Binary thinking, the Manichaean division of the world. These are colonial ways of seeing the world. And I think that what happened in so many countries, even if they weren't directly colonized, like Turkey or Iran, right, is that modernity is forged in response to the encounter with with a colonizing Europe, right? And so, the reactions to that become very binary, whether it's the Aryan nationalism of the Pahlavi dynasty, or it's the reactive Islamic Shiism nationalism and, of the Islamic Republic, right? These are all reactions to, what's going to be our authentic nationalist ideology, right? Either to rival Europe or to reject the West or to be like the West, right? It's just like this binary bouncing back and forth. And I think that those are the terms of the US-Iran standoff in terms of the way it's imagined geopolitically, these two states with these counterposed ideologies. And, we have on one side democracy and on the one side, and on the other side, oppression and, all the ways that people think about that. And I think that the diaspora, we can get stuck in that where we feel like the only choices, that there's two choices, right? And this is how it's a binary, right? That there's only two options, either the Islamic Republic or some kind of Western-backed, intervention, maybe not military, but political or, some kind of pro-Western, Western-oriented government in Iran that would integrate Iran into the global capitalist system, and that would be 1,000 times better than what we have now. And I mean, I understand that where people are coming from, right? But I think that what people in Iran are fighting for on the ground is neither of those. I don't think they actually want to be a neo-colony of the US, nor do they want to continue to suffer under this regime, right? People actually want something else, something that is both national sovereignty, and kinds of forms of democracy, economic reorganization, bodily autonomy, that we can't quite imagine, right? That's what people are fighting for. It doesn't fit in on either side of that binary. And I think we just have to really move away from thinking our only choices are between, the Shah or the Islamic Republic. I mean, this is really a rehash at this point, but how do we move outside of those logics, right? Of Islam versus the West, of the kind of geopolitical terms. And I think one of the ways we do that is by, instead of seeing the relationship between governments, US versus Iran, is what's going to be the relationship between popular movements, between liberation movements, between struggles for freedom. And this is something that I'm always trying to open a conversation about, is how might we, we're in a different historical moment, but how might we imagine reknitting Iran, reknitting the Iranian freedom struggle back into that web of freedom struggles that's unfolding in the West, as well as in the global South, as we now call it.
Yeah. And we also have, in some ways, the other part of this moment that we're living through is we have the example of what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq as, neighbors to Iran that have resulted in disaster for the people of Iraq and Afghanistan in terms of prolonged US intervention and occupation in those countries has not resulted in a liberated Iraq or Afghanistan. In fact, the reaction has been pretty awful in terms of the state repression and violence. And in the case of Afghanistan, obviously a religious clerical regime that has come full circle again. So I think that's the other sort of cautionary kind of logic here that prevents us from gravitating towards that binary, is to say, well, we have examples very immediately at our disposal to understand as bad practices for replacing a dictatorial regime with something that comes at the hands of the US involvement. So then my next kind of question is, both thinking about the idea of affect and affective solidarities, and also thinking about lessons in democratic practice. Are there things that you think were particularly important in the past that might be useful to this present moment, either for us who are in the US, part of a diaspora, looking at Iran and wanting to provide some support, solidarity, meaningful democratic exercise to aid that, but also understanding that it's impacting us here as well. Like the attack on women's rights is not, just in Iran, it's right here in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really big and important question. So I'm trying to think about where to start. I mean, one of the key takeaways that we can learn from the ISA in that era is really about these affects of solidarity, is like, how do we really connect, how do we generate affective attachments to freedom in Iran among other activists here fighting their own struggles, right? And vice versa. How do we actually, make it so that Iranians feel like we're not just fighting for freedom in Iran, but freedom in Iran is actually linked, or the issues that would constitute freedom in Iran, like reproductive justice, like abolishing the prisons, like ending the death penalty, like that these are issues that people are actively organizing around right here, So one question is sort of, how do we really build connections between our movements, so that we, moving away from the US versus Iran binary or the West versus Islam binary, we understand that actually patriarchal authoritarianism is on the rise globally, and it takes different forms. It's not the same everywhere. It has different ideological colorings and manifests in different kinds of policies, and yet they're not completely disconnected phenomena. And in fact, we have a lot to learn from, for example, the struggles of women in Latin America, feminists there, and how they've resisted austerity and the gender politics of these kind of authoritarian neoliberal states, right? So how do we begin to not have Iran be like this walled off, separate thing that's just about, the nuclear deal and geopolitics and, how do we contain Iran? It's a threat, is the US gonna go to war or not? That's sort of where Iran lives for people, it doesn't yet, it began to change, I think, in the fall with Women, Life, Freedom, but like, how do we make Iran sort of legible and resonate with many, many other people as, a relatable place where people are fighting for their freedom, just like many people are fighting for their freedom elsewhere, including here, right? Issues of police violence, there's so many ways, the militarization of society, there's so many ways you could make connections, even though I'm not saying they're the same, they're not at all, right? They have very distinct histories and forms, but they're not completely disconnected either. So how do we begin to make those kinds of global connections in this moment that would be akin to the kinds of connections people were making before? That's sort of one question. And the other question, in terms of what we can learn, is the ISA was really interesting. The Confederation on the surface, or at one level, was a kind of mass democratic organization. Like, it really was. It was open to all Iranian students, and people voted. They voted on all their decisions. They elected leaders that were callable. They had many, many really important democratic practices and principles that were real, that were genuine, and in some ways it's maybe the grandest experiment we have in democratic self-organization among large numbers of Iranians. They happen to be in diaspora, right? They happen to be outside of Iran, but it really was a kind of vast experiment in self-organization and democratic organization. Within the ISA, leftist political parties kind of formed, right? And began to, operate within the broader coalition. And this eventually led to sectarianism and splits and problems. At the same time, though, people still remember it as this mass democratic formation that they're really proud of. Like they're really proud of that piece, and so it's worth noticing that it wasn't all sectarianism and splits and internecine, that there also was the ability to come together and to organize together and to be democratic. So I think that's an important legacy as well.
Yes. I'm mindful of the time. It's 11:30, and I want to make sure that if the audience wants to engage, I, of course, can ask more things and would be delighted to do so, but I want to make sure that the audience has an opportunity.
Thank you. No, this was a very educational and important conversation that you had. It kind of answered, of course, several of my questions. As you know, now, yes, I would love to let the audience also ask any questions that they might have, or otherwise I can ask you a few more questions that I have. Yeah, sure. All right. In the meantime, let me ask you something. That when you were talking about this lack of coherence in our ideologies, and the fact that it seems like we can't really agree on something to work toward, and it seems like we basically can't find a way to agree with each other on something, like find a common ground. So that's something that always brings us to a point where we start disintegrating. After forming a coalition, after coming together, trying to work on something, at the end, it seems like we are still to this day lacking something. So I wanted to ask about that. How was that experience in 1979? Because first of all, and how does that relate to today's situation? Because it seems like you are describing the experiences of pre-1979 as a kind of experience where people actually did practice democratic cooperation and networking and diplomatic behavior, like creating coalitions, and they even went as far as even cooperating with transnational and international movements like the Blacks movement in the US, or working with Arabs and other groups of people that were also anti-imperialists, or that were also fighting against some system of oppression or repression. So that they were doing that, but how did they not foresee that after the revolution, after 1979, they are going to be removed from the political scene in Iran? Because it seems like there was some kind of like a conversation or some kind of negotiations going on between these different political factions, like the leftists and the national liberals and the Islamists. There were negotiations between them. But what do you think went wrong there? What caused them not being a part of the political scene at the end and being defeated by the Islamists in Iran?
Yeah.
What was there some kind of a pattern that you see still going on in there? Is that coming from some sort of a national identity crisis that we seem to have always?
I mean, I wouldn't I wouldn't sort of pathologize it or say, I mean, I think that, people obviously were shaped by our histories and material conditions. And so when you have generations of different kinds of police states where no opposition is tolerated. You can't hold a meeting without getting arrested. I mean, you know, this, how are you going to develop a democratic culture? I mean, it's like really, really hard. You know what I mean? And so under conditions of extreme repression, when the left organizes, they organize in really rigid, dogmatic ways. And some of that is safety. You have to really control everything, you know, and make sure people aren't going to betray you. So there's something about the material conditions of police states, of authoritarianism that kind of reproduces authoritarian behaviors. You know what I mean? Because that's, you know, you're dealing with that kind of power, and you're vulnerable to it. And so efforts to control, to, you know, make things, you know, I mean, this is part of how it becomes almost like a survival strategy, right? And I think that so that's maybe more particular to Iran than other places. However, the left has a history of dogmatism, you know, I mean, in country after country, that's not specific to one national identity or religious context. And again, I think this has to do with how difficult it is to actually take power and change society. It's so hard that people become attached to my idea, my version, my theory, my model. This is the right one. And if you don't think this is the right one, you're going to ruin you're going to sabotage our chances. So I'm going to have to crush you so that I can move forward with the thing that I think is going to make it possible, right? So under, again, conditions of sort of being really disempowered, right? Being and often really facing the brunt of a lot of repression, people become rigid, you know, and can take that out on each other. So I think that some of those cultural patterns in terms of the left and its dogma and its comes out of those kinds of conditions of being a tiny minority with no power, trying to do this world historic thing, and that, you know, produces these kinds of phenomenon. But how did they not see it coming? I mean, you know, how did the left not know that they were supporting Khomeini and Khomeini was going to persecute the left, right? So, you know, there are more books written on this subject than I can even, you know, I took an entire class once in graduate school where we just read every week a different book that tried to explain what the hell happened, you know? So I guess I'm compelled by different explanations. I mean, I do think, Behruz Ghamidi Tabrizi's argument is that the left itself was pretty authoritarian. You know, they really weren't very democratic. So you find examples where they were calling for, executing the Shah's former officials and kind of restarting the wheels of prisons, torture, executions. They were calling for that kind of repression, which then gets used against them, right? So where there's, again, a lack of an emphasis on democracy when you feel the revolution is in danger. And so it feels like strategically, you've got to kill all your enemies to save the revolution. Well, once you start killing people, right? I mean, this is now a logic of what you do with dissent, what you do with disagreement, right? And the left, of course, did not have power. The left was not in charge of the prisons or the courts or the execution machinery, right? So the left never has any control over this, but initially they do support a ramping up of the repressive apparatus of the new post-revolutionary state. I think that they really had, the most generous reading is that people were incredibly naive and they imagined themselves in a coalition, almost as if they were on equal terms, as a kind of united front against US imperialism. And that they kind of made common cause around that issue, despite other disagreements with Islamists, that they were willing to overlook for the sake of, again, the primary struggle. If you think the primary struggle, this is why I think it's a hierarchical model. If the primary struggle is against imperialism, then everything else, democracy, women's rights, ethnic minority rights, religious minority rights, everything else comes secondary. Freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, all of these things you can justify, they have to be suspended in the name of silencing your enemies, to save the revolution, to stop the imperialists, right? So those were the logics that the left also subscribed to. And we know from history in Iran, but in also many other places, that, Western powers do intervene to try to sabotage and undermine revolutions. And, you know, many people have shown that the US basically helps to start the Iran-Iraq war and helps to fund and fuel that war with weapons to both sides, which is part of a sort of a punishment for the Iranian Revolution, right? Not to mention sanctions. So it is both true that there are threats from outside, and the problem is that the paranoia and the worry about those threats becomes a justification for silencing dissent. So you can't tolerate any disagreement because it will weaken the revolution, and that, you know, and that's the great tragedy, right? Sorry, Persis, you want to jump in?
Oh, I just want to add something, a kind of parallel, I mean, that we can look at in the US context, was that while institutions may have been stronger here, democratic institutions, so that people could imagine these struggles, like struggles for civil rights, were part of an ideal where there were institutions that supposedly would protect them. There were efforts to stamp out and divide people and repress people in this country. So the FBI, COINTELPRO, there were actually efforts mobilized to create division within the United States. And I think that's not unique to Iran, is this idea that the state actually intervened to create mechanisms to divide people and make them suspicious of each other in the US context. And in Iran, there weren't the same kinds of institutional foundations to prevent that going awry. I mean, because Iran had so little democratic practices before 79, it's no wonder, really, if you think about it, people couldn't participate in free and fair elections. People were limited by their abilities to participate in parliament. And we also have the model of the 1905 to 1911 constitutional revolution, which was another attempt to create democratic practices in Iran. And that was essentially intervened in also by outside forces. So I think Iran had even shakier grounds in 1979 than we can even imagine, because there was so little opportunities for organizing and democratic practice. And certainly the student movement in Iran was regularly persecuted, right? Jailed, tortured, imprisoned. So I think the idea was that people didn't really have any kind of institutional foundations, and all they had was the model of repression and kind of division in their past. So it's not an excuse, but I think in some ways we have to understand Iran in its own arc of history had much less opportunity, for example, than student movements and civil rights movement in this country that had these, at least these ideals, right? Even if they were false or only partially delivered upon. And I think that idea of state repression and police violence is something we're seeing so much in what's happening in Iran, that what happens is all it takes is those 3 executions or these, you know, the regular practice of false confessions to make people afraid and unable to really feel trusting of even their closest comrades, because this is a state that sort of traffics in that as a mechanism to maintain its power.
That's a very good point, which probably like suggests that if we want to do anything, if you want to make any change towards freedom and democracy, the first step is to stand against any kind of violence, right? Like any kind of verbal or physical violence, like not only again when it happens by the Islamic Republic in Iran, but also when it happens by us, like in the diaspora, against other people, when we cancel other people, when we silence other people, during the past 8 months in the Woman Life Freedom, we have repeatedly seen in the Iranian diaspora that this has been a recurring scene by the far right extremists, by all kinds of extremists that on social media and in real life they would go after people that they don't agree with, and they would try to just silence them and make them afraid of consequences. So I think that was a great point that you brought up. That's very important if you want to create a movement for democracy. It's very important to start from standing against violence both inside Iran and outside Iran.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big lessons here is like, how do we have to not reproduce the logic of dictatorship, in any form, right? We have to be able to disagree without persecuting. You're right. I mean, we have to stop reproducing the logic of the police state that can brook no dissent. I think another key lesson from the ISA and that era that is important for us today is that the Iranian students who came here and joined the ISA, they had a very critical attitude towards US society, towards being in the US. They didn't have that binary. They didn't think, oh, Iran was one giant prison and now I'm free and I'm in the land of freedom. That's not how they felt. It's not how they saw the United States. They saw the United States as a place that was really a battleground, right? That there were all kinds of liberal democratic freedoms here that they didn't have in Iran, but their attitude wasn't to idealize those or somehow counterpose them. It was to use them. It was to use them and to push them really to the breaking point, because eventually the US government did try to round up and deport all Iranians as a punishment for their anti-imperialism, as I've written about. But for many years, they took advantage of freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech to oppose US foreign policy and to support anti-racist and other liberation movements here. So they saw the US as a space where people were fighting for their freedom, not as a place that was already liberated, right? That they could either assimilate to be like or whatever. They saw this as a site of unfolding freedom struggles for decolonization. I mean, they knew about what happened to Native Americans, and they went to, rallies, and Native Americans came to their rallies. There was a connection they were making with the people who had been left out of the American dream, or who the dream had been built on their backs, right? That's where they identified, that's how they situated themselves. So I think this is a real question. How do we situate ourselves in the United States? How do we, take advantage of the opportunities that we have here because of the struggles that have come before us? We do have the ability to have meetings like this, and I'm probably not going to get arrested for having this meeting, right? And that's really important. So we do have these privileges and these spaces and these opportunities. How do we use them? And if we really want to make connections between, as I was saying before, struggles for justice around the world, it's very hard to do that if we look to the US government as our ally, because the US government is actually the source of oppression that all these other movements are fighting against, right? So is the US state our ally, or are we allied with others resisting, right, state oppression here and in many other contexts, right? I think those are some of the questions, like, what is our relationship to US society? How do we situate ourselves? Who are our allies? How do we define America, right? I mean, these are also really big questions that as a diaspora, because we live here, we have to address. Like, we can't pretend we're not, we're in Iran or we're not here or whatever. We have to actually engage with this society, which is an extremely polarized, segregated, really brutal and violent society, right? It's not the same as Iran, but we look at it's different kinds of violence, different histories, different state forms. But the question is, can we also have that critique of US society that can strengthen our movements and open up new roots of solidarity and connection that don't flow through, states?
Right. That's very important. Are there any questions from the audience that you would like to ask? Otherwise, I have a follow-up question on what you were saying.
If I could just add one thing, the other part of, you're kind of positing this question about the diaspora, and Manijeh's argument essentially is that democracy in the United States is an unfinished project, right? We're still experimenting with it. And we're in a painful moment in the United States where democracy is very much under threat. And I think that cannot be overstated enough, is that, the fact of what happened in 2016 and then in 2021 and the Supreme Court, those are all in some ways indicators of the threat to a democratic society that we're living in. And for those in the diaspora who are looking to Iran to topple this regime, in some ways it's a naive notion to not understand that the mechanisms of state repression, attacks on democracy, attacks on women's rights are active and actually quite visible now in a way that I've never seen it in my lifetime. So it's very easy for people in the diaspora to attack somebody they might not agree with, and yet they're not really participating in the process of generating a more democratic society and that models something for example, Iran. And I too am troubled by that, that idea that people are so intolerant, they'll cancel things, they'll, shame people, whatever. And I think it's a real anxiety about trying to control something that we have no control over. We have very little control over what's happening in Iran. And at best, we can engage in sort of acts of solidarity. And I wonder if I could sort of invite Manijeh to talk a little bit about Feminists for Jina, an organization she's involved in, because I think they're trying to model some of that idea, both transnational and democratic practice through the lens of a feminist practice.
Yeah, sure. I mean, in late September, early October, this new network, Feminists for Jina, kind of sprung up through word of mouth and connections, and it's really formed and led by Iranian women who grew up in the Islamic Republic. Many of them were women's rights activists, and were part of the student movement, part of the women's movement in Iran in different phases and modes, and they're in diaspora now, and came together to try to connect us across cities, with each other, but also to try to put out a kind of feminist politics that is, really internationalist, right? And that is really what I'm calling intersectional, or that is a kind of feminist politics that understands the struggles of women and gender nonconforming people and sexual minorities to be intricate, intertwined with the struggles of Kurds and Baluch and the poor and the working class and Afghan migrants and Afghans who have been born in Iran and have no citizenship rights, and to try to have a kind of capacious vision of liberation and freedom, to think about women life freedom as calling to end all these forms of oppression, not just one or the other. And so it's really in that tradition of a kind of revolutionary feminism, right? That's about transforming the society, the government, but not just the government, how we treat each other, our social relations, how we inhabit our bodies, right? And this is really taking the lead from the movement in Iran, that is what people have been creating on the ground there. And so feminist Regina is trying to uplift those elements, right, of the revolution. And also, I think, to resist the co-optation of women left freedom by sort of Western governments and, pro-Western kinds of politics and policies, and the co-optation of women left freedom by people who aren't really interested in feminism per se, or liberation of Kurds or whatever. They just want to get rid of the Islamic Republic by any means necessary. And this is now something they've seized on as a kind of way to further those ends, right? So to try to actually hold out a transnational feminist space, a space that's for the self-determination of Iranian people, all Iranian people, right? And that really is inspired and influenced by many feminist movements outside of Iran. The abolitionist feminist movement, for example, the Kurdish movement, the Kurdish women's movement, for example, right? The movements in Latin America. One thing that Feminist Regina did was a series of performances of the Chilean feminist song, which in English is A Rapist in Your Path. And it's this performance with lyrics and movements that is about calling out patriarchal violence at every level of society, the government, the police, but also families and communities, right? And this was translated into Farsi. Women first performed it in Iran, and then in the diaspora, right? So trying to make those connections with movements, feminist movements against patriarchal authoritarianism, police state violence that are happening in Latin America, and connect Iran, to those frameworks, right? So I think it's a really historic development to have a transnational diasporic formation with those kinds of politics that's actually trying to connect with other movements.
There's a question.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yes. Roja is asking that you have mentioned that how do we do this? How do we let people know that they can fight against oppression regardless of who the oppressor is? And she's saying that many times we find ourselves criticizing the US in the same spaces that the Islamic Republic is criticizing them.
Yeah.
And this can cause many problems internally, and trying to prove that we are not supporting the Islamic Republic, even though they happen to agree with some issues with us. And this is a very good, interesting question, because it's I think it goes targets the heart of the problem. It is a sophistication or a complication or a twist in understanding the situation that unfortunately it seems like many of us in the Iranian diaspora have a hard time quite grasping.
Yeah.
That if we say something that happens to agree with some of the views of the Islamic Republic, or something that Khomeini and Khamenei said, that doesn't mean that we are one of them. There is no such a binary. There can be many different ways of looking at a problem. So you can talk about that.
This is such an important question, and this is also what makes it harder to build solidarity around Iran than around other movements where the horrible government is a US ally. You know what I'm saying? So because, for example, within the US, any country that's ruled by a dictatorship that the US supports, it's very easy to build solidarity because the activists here are already against the US, right? So they make the connections very easily. What gets confusing is, for some leftists here, is that the Islamic Republic says that it's anti-imperialist. They say that they're pro-Palestine. They make comments sometimes against, when Black people are killed by police in the US, they might say something about how horrible racism is in the US. And so some people on the left in the United States are confused by that. And they actually think the Islamic Republic is some kind of more progressive, ally or something, right? And that also, so that's one way that this gets complicated and harder. And then the other side is among Iranians that if you criticize the US, you sound like the Islamic Republic. So there's obviously if you're talking to someone who has good faith, who actually isn't just attacking you and persecuting you, but actually, you can actually have a conversation with, I think one of the main things we have to go after is we have to absolutely debunk the idea that the Islamic Republic is anti-imperialist. It is not. It is anti-American, and it is an imperialist power in the region. It has no problem with intervening and in the affairs of other countries undemocratically, in Iraq, in Syria, in Palestine, right? I mean, it is not an anti-imperialist government. I want to just take that away from them. Okay, I want to take that away from them. They are not anti-imperialist. They are vying for regional power, and they intervene all over the place, just like other governments do, right? I mean, they're more limited in scope than what the US can do, but believe me, if they could, they would exert their power all over the place too. So I don't think they're anti-imperialist. And then I think the other thing is around, when they talk about Palestine, or they talk about, police violence against Black people or something like that, we have to just call, they're utter hypocrites. They're utter hypocrites. First of all, police violence, please. How many people have they, you can't, they have no, that's just ridiculous. And then with Palestine, I think this is a really important thing for us. This is actually something I'm working on and I'm writing about, because I think it gets in the way of building the kind of international solidarity that we want to have when Iran and Palestine are pitted against each other. For so many Iranians feel like the Islamic Republic is pro-Palestinian, and so, that's not our issue. We are almost triggered by that, right? So I think we have to say, that the Islamic Republic is not pro-Palestinian. They are intervening for their own agenda, for their own interests in Gaza, right? This is about regional power politics. This is not about democracy for Palestinians or freedom for Palestinians or self-determination for Palestinians. It's just not, and we have to, again, reclaim the issue of Palestine away from them. Let's not give that to them. They are doing this for their own reasons, and they are spreading a kind of politics that, many Palestinians do not want to live under that kind of political, it's not democratic at all, right? It's about military funding and the rest of it. It's a totally militarized form, right, that they export. So, I think, again, we have to have our own language for this. We have to take these issues away from them. We have to take those phrases that they have used and abused away from them, and redefine, that no, we are the pro-Palestinian ones because we want freedom and democracy everywhere, and the Iranian government stands in the way of that, actually, in the region. It is not on the side of self-determination in the region, actually. So these are some of the ways that I'm trying to think about this and talk about this, because it's not easy and it's not automatic to have the kind of solidarity around Palestine or with other Arab movements that we had in the 60s and 70s, when all the governments were backed by the US, and you could have a kind of ideological coherence, right, where they would say we're against US imperialism and the Arab dictatorships, and that was one thing. Now, it's more complex when Iran is a sovereign nation, so, but I think these are the kind of conversations that we need to have a kind of battle of ideas, right, where we try to redefine what a leftist politics really means in practice, and really disabuse people of the idea that the Islamic Republic is some kind of progressive, force that should be defended as a bulwark against Zionism or, US interests.
Exactly. And I think, the Islamic Republic has now at this point made it completely clear with how they support the Chinese and Russia, and the relationship between the Islamic Republic and China and Russia just, I think, is at this point enough proof that their problem is not imperialism anymore, because if it was, they would have a problem with what Russia is doing now in Ukraine, and what
Exactly.
what China is doing with the Muslim Chinese, or what it's doing with Taiwan now.
Exactly.
So I think you are completely right that it is very important to become aware of that, and that and to reclaim the ideas that the Islamic Republic tried for decades to reappropriate and to basically adopt, to say that yes, we are on the same page with many other movements, global movements. At this point, I think they have lost all of that, and that is probably why the reason behind what we have been seeing during the past, 6, 7, 8 months, that we see that there is this unprecedented level of resentment against the Islamic Republic, even within Iran.
Exactly.
So with that, I would like to thank you both for joining us today. If there is anything else that you would like to say, please do so. Otherwise, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time and being with us. This was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And of course, I will have to rewatch this multiple times and read the book, This Flame Within, to really get to the depth of what you're talking about. If this is not something simple to understand, as much as we were saying that there are so many twists and complications to these problems these days that we have a hard time understanding. We can't assume that these are easy to understand. So this requires a lot of thinking, a lot of reading, and again, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity.
Well, thank you so much, Amin, and Persis. Thank you for making this space and for this opportunity, and I really appreciate it. Thank you for your thoughtful engagement with the book. It's been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Amin Jun, and thank you, Manijeh, for your wonderful work. And I would really suggest also, if people want to read this book, read it with that same kind of focus that you brought to it, Amin, which was, this is an opportunity for us to revisit a history that's still relevant. So I hope that people will do that.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Have a good day.